Okay, continuing along with Report from Iron Mountain. We are in Section 5, the functions of war. Sociological. Under this heading, we will examine a nexus of functions served by the war system that affect human behavior in society. In general, they are broader in application and less susceptible to direct observation than the economic and political factors previously considered. The most obvious of these functions is the time-honored use of military institutions to provide antisocial elements with an acceptable role in the social structure. The disintegrative, unstable social movements, loosely described as fascist, have traditionally taken root in societies that have lacked adequate military or paramilitary outlets to meet the needs of these elements. This function has been critical in periods of rapid change. The danger signals are easy to recognize, even though the stigmata bear different names at different times. The current euphemistic cliches, juvenile delinquency and alienation, have had their counterparts in every age. In earlier days, these conditions were dealt with directly by the military without the complications of due process, usually through press gangs or outright enslavement. But it is not hard to visualize, for example, the degree of social disruption that might have taken place in the United States during the last 2 decades if the problem of the socially disaffected of the post-war World War II period had not been foreseen and effectively met. The younger and more dangerous of these hostile social groupings have been kept under control by the selective service system. This system and its analogs elsewhere furnish remarkably clear examples of disguised military utility. Informed persons in this country have never accepted the official rationale for a peacetime draft, military necessity, preparedness, etc., as worthy of serious consideration. But what has gained credence among thoughtful men is the rarely voiced, less easily refuted proposition that the institution of military service has a patriotic priority in our society that must be maintained for its own sake. Ironically, the simplistic official justification for selective service comes closer to the mark once the non-military functions of military institutions are understood. As a control device over the hostile, nihilistic, and potentially unsettling elements of a society in transition, the draft can again be defended, and quite convincingly, as a military necessity. Nor can it be considered a coincidence that overt military activity, and thus the level of draft calls, tend to follow the major fluctuations in the unemployment rate in the lower age groups. This rate, in turn, is a time-tested herald of social discontent. It must be noted also that the armed forces in every civilization have provided the principal state-supported haven for what we now call the unemployable. The typical European standing army of 50 years ago consisted of troops unfit for employment in commerce, industry, or agriculture, led by officers unfit to practice any legitimate profession or to conduct a business enterprise. This is still largely true, if less apparent. In a sense, this function of the military as the custodian of the economically or culturally deprived was the forerunner of most contemporary contemporary civilian social welfare programs, from the WPA to various forms of socialized medicine and social security. It is interesting that liberal sociologists currently proposing to use the selective service system as a medium of cultural upgrading of the poor consider this a novel application of military practice. Although it cannot be said absolutely that such critical measures of social control as the draft require a military rationale, no modern society has yet been willing to risk experimentation with any other kind. Even during such periods of comparatively simple social crisis as the so-called Great Depression of the 1930s, it was deemed prudent by the government to invest minor make-work projects like the Civilian Conservation Corps with a military character, and to place the more ambitious National Recovery Administration under the direction of a professional Army officer at its inception. Today, at least one small northern European country plagued with uncontrollable unrest among its alienated youth is considering the expansion of its armed forces despite the problem of making credible the expansion of a non-existent external threat. Sporadic efforts have been made to promote general recognition of broad national values free of military connotation, but they have been ineffective. For example, to enlist public support of even such modest programs of social adjustment as fighting inflation or maintaining physical fitness, it has been necessary for the government to utilize a patriotic, i.e., military incentive. It sells defense bonds and it equates health with military preparedness. This is not surprising, since the concept of nationhood implies readiness for war. A national program must do likewise. In general, the war system provides the basic motivation for primary social organization. In doing so, it reflects on the societal level the incentives of individual human behavior. The most important of these, for social purposes, is the individual psychological rationale for allegiance to a society and its values. Allegiance requires a cause. A cause requires an enemy. This much is obvious. The critical point is that the enemy that defies the cause must seem genuinely formidable. Roughly speaking, the presumed power of the enemy sufficient to warrant an individual sense of allegiance to a society must be proportionate to the size and complexity of the society. Today, of course, that power must be one of unprecedented magnitude and frightfulness. It follows from the patterns of human behavior that the credibility of a social enemy demands similarly a readiness of response in proportion to its menace. In a broad social context, an eye for an eye still characterizes the only acceptable attitude toward a presumed threat of aggression, despite contrary religious and moral precepts governing personal conduct. The remoteness of personal decision from social consequence in a modern society makes it easy for its members to maintain this attitude without being aware of it. A recent example is the war in Vietnam. A less recent one was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In each case, the extent and gratuitousness of the slaughter were abstracted into political formulae by most Americans once the proposition that the victims were enemies was established. The war system makes such an abstracted response possible in non-military contexts as well. A conventional example of this mechanism is the inability of most people to connect, let us say, the starvation of millions in India with their own past conscious political decision making. Yet the sequential logic linking a decision to restrict grain production in America with an eventual famine in Asia is obvious, unambiguous, and unconcealed. And we will pick up with part 4 of section 5, the functions of war, in the next video.